So let's look at each of these three levels of analysis a little more closely. We'll start with the highest level, the computational theory. Now, Marr describes the computational theory as follows. What is the goal of the computation? Why is it appropriate? And what is the logic of the strategy by which it can be carried out? And so we can think of the computational theory as giving us certain elements of our computational explanations. It introduces a task specification in terms of an information mapping. What are we starting from, and what are we trying to make inferences to? A beginning and an ending. And this corresponds to the way I talk about idealized task functions, the inputs and the outputs, the function that characterizes them. Our computational theory also specifies the type of inference definitive of the task. So how is it? What's the strategy that the system is going to employ overall to try and solve this problem characterized by that information mapping? And in doing so, it also defines success and failure conditions, right? So it's got to be able to map inputs to outputs correctly, and it's got to be able to do it using this particular kind of strategy. What else? Well, it establishes the ecological validity of the task specification. So it attempts to understand how it is that the system is trying to make this inference in this world. And that means it's going to make a case for the descriptive adequacy of the task specification. It's going to make the case for this is what we are really doing when we engage in visual processing. And that means it's going to talk about whether or not the theory, the computational theory that is, provides us with behavioral adequacy. Does it explain how we behave? Well, and teleological adequacy as well. Does it explain how we behave relates to the overall cognitive functioning of that system? And in doing so, it introduces this epistemic characterization, which in my lectures I separate out as the epistemic theory. And it establishes the task's general tractability requirements. What am I doing? What's my strategy? Does that characterization prove behaviorally and functionally adequate for understanding the phenomenon? It introduces success and failure criterion, and it also introduces tractability. Is this a function that can be computed within those constraints? Next, there's the representations and algorithms level. Now, this is not quite down to the actual computer. It's more like a specification of a specific strategy for implementing the overall strategy. So he says, how can this computational theory be implemented? In particular, what is the representation for the input and the output, and what is the algorithm for transformation? So we're going to specify representations in terms of the information that they make explicit, at least for the input and the output, probably for a number of intermediary stages as well. We're going to specify the general inferential steps in terms of their role in the overall inference. So we're going to break down that complex problem into a series of simpler problems. I do this, then I do this, then I do this, then I do that. And it's going to specify a control structure, the order of the operations or steps. So I do this first, then I do this, then I do this, then I do this, then I do that. So it gives a flow of processing as well. What else? Well, it establishes the specified task theoretic tractability. Once we have representations and algorithms, we can come up with proofs about whether or not the system can satisfy this strategy, and compute this strategy within a reasonable time limit. We can start to note possible environmental constraints. We can establish some sense of its computability and its complexity. How hard is it to do? Can we do it? And finally, when we get to the implementation level, it's the nuts and bolts about how the physical system actually accomplishes the other two levels of description. It's the physical theory that I refer to in my lectures. So we're going to specify the specific structures bearing the represented information. What is that structure that does the representing for us? It's going to specify the basic operations on the structures that realize each of the algorithmic steps. And it's going to specify the control structure, what order those basic operations get executed in order to compute the total algorithm. And then by looking at how the physical system functions, we can establish whether the physical system can actually perform the task, can make that inference, can go from input to output in a reasonable amount of time so that the system can solve the problem in time to use the information that it gleans. So this will determine how or if environmental tasks can get exploited and how they're exploited. And it'll determine computability and complexity for this particular system. How does this system solve this problem? So now that we have our strategy for explaining the problem, we have to come up with a characterization of vision. We have to introduce the sort of computational theory. And this is what Marr tells us it is, in his broadest strokes anyway. He says, vision is a process that produces from images of the external world a description that is useful to the viewer and not cluttered with irrelevant information. We have already seen that a process may be thought of as a mapping from one representation to another. And in the case of human vision, the initial representation is in no doubt. It consists of arrays of image intensity values as detected by the photoreceptors of the retina. So what picture of vision emerges from this? Well, there are a number of important features in Marr's characterization of vision. And this was a pretty standard way of understanding vision, I think, for the most part. Anyway. So vision is going to operate on a single data set, reflectance patterns in the back of my eye. It's going to be a single stepwise process working towards a single end goal, an end representation. And that end representation is going to be a single general purpose representation of the visual world that makes the information that's important for operating in that world explicit and isn't cluttered with other sorts of information that isn't useful. And so we can kind of view how Marr breaks this down into a stepwise process as follows. Right? So he gives us this idea of vision as recovering features of the world from this very impoverished initial stimuli at the back of the retina. So we start off with those images, the back of our eye, and then we create what he calls a primal sketch. We start to figure out where possible edges and boundaries of objects might be. From that, we create a 2.5D sketch. That is a sketch that helps us to understand how the objects are put together. And finally, we create a 3D model. So we start with that input, we detect edges, we start to detect our 2.5D sketch where we start to figure out the two-dimensional patterns of objects in the environment, and then we put them into our 3D model. We'll pick up with this point next time and go through each of these steps a little bit more carefully.